Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Brandywine online for our virtual program, Behind the Scenes, The Eye of the Earth. My name is Bailey Gamberg, and I'm the educator for adult and community programs at the Brandywine Museum of Art. I'm going to start with just a few reminders. We greatly encourage you to come visit in person and see this fantastic exhibition titled Andrew Wyeth at Kuerner Farm, The Eye of the Earth. This exhibit includes a range of work across Andrew Wyeth's lifetime, focusing on the subjects and landscape of Kuerner Farm. The exhibit will be open until September 28th at Brandywine, and then we'll travel to the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens in Jacksonville, Florida. I'd also like to share that next month, on July 21st and 22nd at 7 p.m., we will be hosting two virtual talks with Victoria Wyeth, the granddaughter of Andrew Wyeth. This program will be specifically focusing on Andrew's use of color across mediums. You can learn more information and register by checking out the events page on our website. Another virtual program we have coming up is around our extended Barbara Sherman exhibition. On Tuesday, July 8th at 2 p.m., Brandywine Senior Curator Amanda Burden will be having a discussion with Amanda Gormley, one of Sherman's descendants. The program is called Searching for Sherman, as Gormley describes the story of uncovering her family's history and eventually collaborating with the curator of the show. Again, you can find more information and register on our website. Lastly, there will be an in-person program tied to this exhibition on Wednesday, August 7th from 6 to 8 p.m. between Carl J. Kuerner, an artist and third generation of the Kuerner family, and Karen Baumgartner, the collection manager of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Collection of the Wyeth Foundation for American Art. This event is not yet live on the website, but will be on site at Brandywine, so keep an eye out for future events. Because we are in Zoom webinar, your mic is automatically muted and your camera is turned off for the presentation. Please feel free to use the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions throughout the program, and we will get to answering all of them at the end. We will also be recording this talk and sharing the link out in a few weeks once the video has been edited. We're grateful to have with us today Dr. William L. Coleman, the Wyeth Foundation Curator and Director of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center. And I will hand it over to him to share more about this lovely new exhibition and how it came to be.
Thank you, Bailey, and thank you all for being with us this evening. We're excited to share this new exhibition that has been a labor of a couple of years with the staff of two different museums collaborating on this nationally traveling project. It's been such a thrill finally to see this thing on the walls of the Andrew Wyeth Gallery at Brandywine, and we hope you'll come down and see it. If you are local, if you're a diehard Brandywine fan, you're used to seeing a lot of great material from this remarkable story of our region that has gone on to impact others nationwide and around the world. We do a lot of great work with Andrew Wyeth. We're trying to bring new audiences and new insight. But this is something of a different magnitude with major loans from across the country, a big nationally distributed catalog, and some really exciting opportunities to bring these far-flung works back home to the context that created them. So you get an initial sense of this in an artwork I'll talk about a little bit later. What we're talking about with the Kuerner Farm is a hardworking agricultural site, now part of the Brandywine Museum of Art, visitable on tours and inspiring other artists to this day with plein air painting workshops and more. We wonder this core question at the heart of our exhibition, why this simple place, a short walk from Andrew Wyeth's studio, inspired such a creative outpouring, nearly 1,000 works of art across 6 decades, a really unusual story in the global history of art, of an artist being so committed to one particular place and excavating its layers and finding all these associations and stories within it. So I'll suggest some of the answers to that. I'll also suggest that this place is fundamental to helping the artist to find his unique lane, what defines an Andrew Wyeth painting. Many of those things crystallized at the Kuerner Farm. So much to say here, and look forward to any questions you might have at the end. As ever, digital images can't do this thing justice, but we'll do our best, and please do come see it, whether at Brandywine or indeed at our final venue, the Commerce Museum in Jacksonville. I'll just share an image of how this looked at its previous venue. This exhibition was co-organized with Reynolda House Museum of American Art in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This is a view in their galleries at that great museum associated with Wake Forest University. It was really well received there. It was the second highest visitation exhibition they've ever done in their new special exhibition wing, about 20 years running. And they sold out a couple of times. The catalog had to keep on buying more copies of it. So it was really fun to see how a different part of the country responded to this story we risk taking for granted in Chadds Ford, where it's very familiar to many of us. At right, the cover of the book there with another artwork I'll say more about later. Really pleased with how that beautiful book came out, published by Brandywine in collaboration with Rizzoli Electa. Essays by me and collaborators in the project, a number of beautiful images, both of works in the show and other far-flung Kuerner Farm related subjects, and a nice perspective from the artist James Welling about what he sees in this site as it continues to inspire new audiences to this day. So there's a nice image that was taken for the catalog by the photographer Joshua McHugh, how it looks today. And we wonder if we didn't see this place through the eyes of Andrew Wyeth, would it stop us in our tracks? Would we recognize there's something special about this place? There is a quiet power to the site. That high white farmhouse at the heart of the property, stucco over fieldstone in the traditional building method of the early Euro-American settlers of Chadds Ford, who were predominantly Quaker. It has this power, that stark whiteness against the farm fields, and that towering Pennsylvania bank barn behind it. This interesting pond in the foreground that gives us our title. Andrew Wyeth called it the eye of the earth, reflecting everything in creation. In short, Andrew Wyeth found in this place the full range of human experience, found that by focusing on this one site to which he earned privileged access, indeed a key to the front door, this pattern that recurs across his life of earning the trust of models who became friends and gaining rare intimacy with their ordinary working lives. All of this crystallizes in the works of art I'll be sharing with you today, roughly in the order in which you'll encounter them in the gallery, but also expanding beyond a march around the gallery, bringing in some additional context and things that you won't see when you're inside the gallery. A lovely image that clarifies that this is a fundamentally pedestrian practice. I've been thinking about what it means to engage in slow looking, to walk over from your studio, the Andrew Wyeth studio, also part of Brandywine now, 10 minutes, 15 minutes over to the Kuerner Farm, and to engage with this simple site. And I use that word simple deliberately because of some of the theological associations of that word, which was the focus of my essay in the catalog. Could say more about that later. He would walk over, just kind of drink in the moods, the sounds of the place on a given day, and then periodically be stopped in his tracks by a new naturally occurring geometry that he had to capture in a quick watercolor, sometimes even in that slow, painstaking medium of egg tempera on panel, to build up an idea over weeks and weeks or even months. So you see him in this classic image walking to and from the site. We start with the earliest known work of the Kuerner Farm, which is in the Brandywine Permanent Collection. We picture the young student artist training with his father, the artist illustrator N.C. Wyeth, not so far away, studying from live models and plaster casts in the studio. And then part of any good artist training is the landscape. And so going out to the subject matter, just as you need a live model there in front of you to understand the human figure, so must you go to the landscape subject to work on capturing fleeting effects of light and weather. And you can just make out there, if you can see my cursor, the form of the Kuerner farmhouse and the bank barn that will recur. We come to realize that we're standing atop another key feature of the site, which is this steep, short Kuerner hill this unusually tight little valley within Chad's Ford that speaks to the artist, and you'll see that shape recur throughout these artworks with this strange dead tree atop the hill, and that sense of mortality will become another recurring theme. This is a place where he quickly hones in on the media that will define his career. You saw previously Andrew Wyeth working in oil on canvas, a medium some might be surprised to learn he ever practiced. Not something that we usually associate with Andrew Wyeth, but indeed there is a small, fascinating body of oils that are in the Wyeth Foundation collection, stored in our two Wyeth study centers for the most part and waiting for their moment in the spotlight. This is more like the media that we think of, although surprisingly colorful. This is clearly a very early watercolor by Andrew Wyeth. One of the earliest watercolors he ever made is, again, that great barn at Kuerner Farm. So he's finding his media. He's finding his way to tempera, that medium with which he's most associated. Egg yolk mixed with distilled water and mineral pigments, an ancient painting medium, and Andrew Wyeth, part of a wider tempera revival in the 1930s, taking up that medium and never setting it aside like some of the other revivalists did later. We see here another view from the top of Kuerner Hill, looking north. You see Mother Archie's Church, the heart of a vibrant AME parish headed by a charismatic preacher known as Mother Lydia Archie. And David Lawrence here apprising us with a double-barreled shotgun in hand. It was a member of that parish, a member of this rich historic African-American community of Chadds Ford, with whom Andrew Wyeth had deep, substantial, sustained relationships, and indeed made many artworks of members of that community. So he's finding his way, and this I think of as a moment where Andrew Wyeth finds his really mature practice. The early work ends, and a really unusual eye takes hold. This gives opportunity to mention that even though this is a national traveling exhibition, not everything you'll see in the galleries at Brandywine is able to travel to our two other venues in North Carolina and Florida. And this is an example of that. Woodshed is an icon. It's one of my favorite temperas by Andrew Wyeth. I'll say a bit about why. It also is pretty challenging in its physical condition. So not something that we can travel for the near future until we find some new technologies, new solutions to stabilize it against the risk of vibration in transit. So it's a Brandywine only exclusive. It's one of the signature images of one of our guiding arguments here, that Wyeth finds his mode of being both realist and modern, both rural and modern, in a period when New York City has consolidated its hold as the global center of the art world for abstract expressionism. Wyeth is operating in a marketplace of ideas, competing with Jackson Pollock, Franz Klein, the latter somebody he mentions repeatedly as a particular favorite. We've talked about Wyeth and abstraction in previous projects because there is such a substantial body of evidence in the archive that we preserve in the Wyeth Study Center that Wyeth thought of himself in dialogue with those artists. And we wonder why. Why is this artist, who often paints so precisely, calling himself, quote, an abstractionist? And maybe in something like this, you can start to see that possibility, to think about a dialogue between Wyeth and someone like Klein, known for black forms on a white background. That's just what we've got here. How strange it is to hone in on two dead crows on a white wall, hardly any space to recede into, confronting you right at the picture surface, and just that, again, recurring form of Kuerner Hill at right to give you a sense of pictorial space. This is a startling idea, a really bold compositional idea, and I hope we can make it strange again. It is the sort of thing that is really helpful to people like me who are conscious of those out there who might not yet be convinced that this artist, who was so popular in his own lifetime that some in the academy, some in the critical establishment have not taken him seriously, was fully a part of the modern art world. And I think we're getting to a much more interesting, much messier story in which we don't have diametrically opposed camps of the capital R realists and the capital A abstractionists. but this fascinating melding of the two. And you will see a lot of work in this show that is startlingly abstract. And even when the brushstrokes are so minute and you can instantly recognize the subject matter, I hope you will see the startling compositional modernism that is at work in things like Woodshed. End of Winter Study for Winter 1946 is a personal favorite that we had to include. This is an artwork I've been thinking about learning from since about 2006 when it was included in the first exhibition I ever curated back at Haverford College, the Pennsylvania Landscape Colonial to Contemporary. This is in a great academic museum, a teaching tool for the students of Dickinson College, and it happens to be the first thing he made after N.C. Wyeth's violent death near Kuerner Farm, and one more of the associations of this site takes shape there. That Kuerner's is a place where the presence of death in life is especially palpable, especially close to the surface. You'll note here that extremely subdued palette. This choice to limit one's own materials, setting aside childish things, those lush green colors of the landscape in favor of this really reduced, austere, indeed simple, hitting that word again, palette that we think of as mature Wyeth. What we could not get for the show, again, because of the fragility of some of the temperas, was this one you may recognize in the North Carolina Museum of Art, for which Winter 1946, the study I showed you was preparatory. A great tempera, monumental work that reflects on that painful early loss that is also bound up with the Kuerner Farm site. So we have an artist who's learning from the pain of life. He's learning from early success as a watercolorist, being received as the natural heir to the likes of Winslow Homer in the American watercolor tradition. It's all coming together at Kuerner's. We're fortunate to have in the exhibition this loan from far off Albuquerque, another of the iconic egg temperas that came out of this site. And we start to engage with the people of the place, which is one of our subplots of the show. My colleague Karen Baumgartner wrote a great essay for the catalog, trying to get beyond some of the received wisdom about these people to who they really were, what were their lives like before we came to know them monolithically, archetypally through the representations of Andrew Wyeth. And you have a sense of that here. For Andrew Wyeth, whether or not the full historical record bears this out, Karl Kuerner is a cold, hard, prototypical farm patriarch, these menacing hooks on which sausages were dried hanging above his head, and this cold gaze confronting us. We know some of the backstory that he was a machine gunner at the Battle of Verdun for the wrong team, I might add. There's this sense of the subtle menace bound up with this person, again, for Wyeth. This is a father. This is a person who is the hub of a vibrant German immigrant community in southeastern Pennsylvania. We try to draw out some of that story, but Wyeth, the student of N.C. Wyeth, who has grown up in that artist illustrator studio full of props and historic weapons, is fascinated by military history, is fascinated by World War I, and finds here this uh, person from the old world who seems to embody that conflict that was rightly or wrongly romantic and fascinating to Andrew Wyeth. That's potential for violence and darkness continues in this strange watercolor that we call a dry brush watercolor, in which you squeeze most of the moisture off of the watercolor brush and you're able to make these very precise, tight lines, verging on the precision of the tempera practice. This was one of the really distinctive modes with which Andrew Wyeth is associated. The story goes, Karl Kuerner was posing with his new hunting rifle, and Anna Kuerner came in to call him down to dinner, ask why he hadn't come down yet. And you get again a kind of a visual poem of a marriage, a conflict between two people, the artist's idea of these two people at odds, presented against a stark white wall that is again the imagination of the artist. And you can even make out he has erased what was there. He has sanded away at the paper to remove the head of a deer that was there, as well as some floral wallpaper. You're getting one of the key ideas I hope visitors come away with, that Andrew Wyeth's practice, however realistic it may seem, is transformative and visionary. These things are modified, warping reality to suit the artist's ends, as is his absolute right. We're also trying to treat the story of the people that inspired him with respect at the same time. There's Karl Kerner again, wearing the 1916 Stahlhelm that he wore in the Battle of Verdun, as well as his great coat. Andrew Wyeth asked him to pose in that uniform again with these visions of that great war, visions of the film he so loved, The Big Parade by King Vidor, in his mind as he captures Karl Kerner against this startlingly abstract background, pooling black pigment drips running down and spattering there that again might suggest a certain dialogue with what was happening in the big city. And we have in the exhibition some family photographs and that original helmet, the specific helmet that the family members still own, included in the case there. So it is an evocative, eerie object. But we hope also people will see, I hope you can make out on your screen, that these were real three-dimensional people, not just the archetypes that Andrew Wyeth gave us. You see Anna Kerner in Wyeth's paintings, always serious and dour, smiling, holding her children, surrounded by beer swilling Germans coming together at the bank barn at Kuerner Farm, and another nice image of the family there. So this is real living history to us in Chadds Ford. We walk this landscape. We know descendants of this community who have steered us right and helped us to get the story right. We have tremendous respect for the visionary Kerners that appear in Andrew Wyeth's work, but we want to introduce you also to the real Kerners. And there, as a fun aside, this little in-gallery snapshot on my cell phone also shows the fun thing we did where we transplanted the bright, floral, surprising wallpaper of the Kerner farm into the gallery on one particular accent wall. We might not expect that kind of bold pattern when we get used to Wyeth giving us these stark white walls. This is something closer to the reality. There's Anna Kerner herself working in the kitchen at the Kerner farm where there would have been that wallpaper here, just evoked with a wash of subtle yellow brown. A fascinating woman in her own right. In the Andrew Wyeth archetypal presentation, she suffers from mental illness. She suffers from chronic pain. She is always in motion, always working. We wonder about her own lived experience in these pictures, and she very rarely agreed to sit for a portrayal by Andrew Wyeth, even as Karl Kerner did build a meaningful friendship with him and agreed to pose on numerous occasions. And then there's another key person of the place, and this is another exclusive to Brandywine object, Lodencoat, a depiction of Helga Testorf, the key model whom Andrew Wyeth first encounters at Kerner Farm, where she had come circa 1970 after Karl Kerner had been diagnosed with leukemia, first to help in tending the garden and then eventually to serve as a nurse for Karl Kerner. Wyeth is again fascinated by this person, seemingly of the old country, the old world, very proud of her Prussian heritage, and wearing this characteristic Loden wool coat or cape coat in Loden wool that recurs in his practice. So much more could be said about Helga Testorf. Indeed, whole exhibitions have been devoted to it. Here, it's important to note this is one more deep well of inspiration that comes out of this site, and you see that crystallize in Lodencoat. We start to zoom out into some of the other features of the property, the facets of the place that captured his imagination. We include in the show this lovely and free study for the tempera Spring Fed. And we see him finding his way to the final composition here. An instrumental object spattered, maybe even bits of rust on it. This is something that has not been babied in a museum vault as it is now. It's had a hard life, but you see it as a useful thinking object. This is an urgent idea captured quickly. The final composition with this water trough into which spring water constantly trickles with this evocative sound still to this day captures the artist's eye. He recognizes a composition he hadn't seen before. He recognizes also the picture within the picture, the distant view of Kuerner Hill. And this was the result. And this picture recently sold at auction. We really pounded the pavement, reached out far and wide to try to figure out where it is now. If anyone knows, please let us know. We sent a blind inquiry via the auction house that sold it, and alas, we were not able to get in touch with the new owner. But this is, again, an example of how the Kuerner Farm gave Andrew Wyeth some of the works with which he's most associated. Evidence of this. This thing is included on US postage. This thing is included in the first exhibition of the work of a living American artist at the White House in his lifetime. So it doesn't get any more canonical than that. It all goes back to Kuerner Farm. We see how these ideas take shape from very free abstract watercolors capturing an urgent idea in that medium that we think of as his key generative tool, his thinking method. This is a fascinating one where he's even gouging away at the surface of the paper to reveal the white splashing water coming out of the pond's outflow into a little stream. And you have this single illuminated window in a much transformed vision of the Kuerner farmhouse. And as our archive tells us, this was the seed of the idea that became Evening at Kuerner's a decade later. One of the best loved works that came out of this place, the sort of thing that invites us to think about the ways in which Andrew Wyeth's realism functions. One could be forgiven for first thinking that this is the work of an artist whose chief merit is technical, skilled at capturing realistically with great detail the outward appearances of observed realities. And the more time you spend with this, the more you recognize how this thing has been modified to suit the artist's ends. And this teaches us to read the fuller practice against the grain, against the wool it is pulling across our eyes, its seeming faithfulness to nature. And we realize that through the effacement of all that was not useful to the artist here. There are a lot more windows on this side of the house, the east side of the house, if memory serves. Electrical wires coming in, driveway, the corner of the barn, chicken coops, a little pasture here. All of that has been erased as unuseful to presenting this eerie, subdued scene of kind of late winter, early spring mud season, snow melt, more brown than green, almost monochromatic. It looks kind of brighter on the screen here than it does in person in the muted light of our gallery. Again, mature Andrew Wyeth, this choice to severely limit one's own materials and this kind of core finding that inspiration develops not from spreading oneself across a broad range of pictorial possibilities, a broad range of color options, but placing those kinds of blinders on oneself, those useful constraints, builds this really remarkable and individual practice. A stark and minimal thing that was one of the inspirations for this show. You'll see from the credit line there, this is in the collection of our co-organizing institution, Reynolda. The name there you might be interested to know is the family behind R.J. Reynolds Tobacco. Lots of tobacco money down there in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This was indeed an heir of the Reynolds family that built up a remarkable collection of American art that has included for many years Kuerner Farm work. And they reached out to us very early in my time at Brandywine to suggest that maybe there's an exhibition here. And the fact that that aligned with 25 years of Brandywine stewardship of this site as a public trust really resonated, and we were happy to go forward. I like this one as an example of how little visual information Andrew Wyeth can give us and still be recognizable as a Kuerner Farm shape. Gives us hardly any visual information, just those high windows, just enough information to recognize this as the pond. This could only be Andrew Wyeth. A few images now in a row that hone in on one of our really major gets for the show, alone we're really proud of. I've shared a few things that in my line of work are part of the challenge. A lot of these temperas are not easy to travel anymore. Some of you maybe saw in retrospect back in 2017, maybe you remember from childhood, big sweeping 3 generations of Wyeth exhibitions. It's getting harder and harder to do those as fewer and fewer temperas travel. But we've put in the work for Friends of the Brandywine. We brought some really great things into the gallery, and I'm going to share how one of them took shape here. So you'll see from the title, this thing that the Delaware Art Museum calls First Snow, we call in our database First Snow Study for Groundhog Day. And this is where Groundhog Day begins. Note that window, note that fence, note that log with the chain around it, and we're going to go in closer toward that window as we move forward. Now we're inside, you see that same log, you see that same fence, that same window. There's this idea of a dog lurking throughout the pictures, and sometimes you see it overtly, sometimes it's implied with just the chain and the collar at the end of it without an occupant. And we culminate in this work that I will convey was a real bear to get loaned, even from 25 miles away. Such an icon of the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection, another of these delicate temperas. We worked for a good number of months to confirm this, and it is indeed now hanging proudly on the wall of the Brandywine Museum of Art, in dialogue with its studies and in dialogue with the site itself, the Kuerner Farm. So this one is probably familiar to many of you if you're familiar with Wyeth at all. Again, one of his best known and best loved works, something that might first just inspire simple memories of home, nostalgia, pleasant emotions. The more time we spend with it, the more we start to recognize that all is not right with the scene, and that we are getting that eerie narrative sensibility, even without any visible personage here, even without overt story transpiring before our very eyes, as you would see in the work of N.C. Wyeth. There's enough to suggest the narrative that the artist was thinking of here. We have a knife without a fork, strange. We have a collar without a dog, strange. We have these splintering teeth like forms emerging from the log. And we come to have this kind of vision of potential violence. And I believe those are the exact words the artist used in describing this as a kind of metonym for Karl Kerner, who we've heard by now was in Andrew Wyeth's concept of him, that personification of World War One, the machine gunner, the darkness of the old world, the darkness, the ordinary brutality of farm life, slaughtering animals, all that came with it, hunting. He gives us just enough to suggest that and to inspire our own imagination. You don't need to know what the artist was thinking when he made it. We've got so much documentation, we could just bury you in it on the walls of these exhibitions. And we've made a conscious choice not to do that because the artist would have wanted us to allow these things to speak for themselves, not to insist on any one monolithic family story. We hear a lot about Wyeth lore, and there's so many stories that have been spun around these works of art, whether or not they're true. And so we share a little bit of what we know the artist to have been thinking, but it is perfectly legitimate for our own minds to wander, for it to continue speaking in new and different ways about a rather unsettling farmhouse kitchen. I really love this one in the show. We go from a really tightly painted extreme to a really free and abstract extreme. And I should clarify, when I say abstract, I'm talking about a reductive method, starting from observed realities and reducing visual information, not starting from a blank page and making random forms on it. Wyeth's abstraction is about finding pure geometries and gestures in his subjects. And we see a hint of that in the chimney atop the Kuerner farmhouse. It's significant as a really beautiful example of Wyeth at his abstract extreme. It's also significant for the title it bears, Chimney Smoke. And by now you've seen a lot of these full captions for Andrew Wyeth works on your screen. It's significant that this one does not have the word study for something else associated with it. It's not, as many of the very free improvisatory watercolors are, titled Untitled. It is given the dignity of a full formal title by Betsy James Wyeth, who is a precondition for her husband's practice, a really important part of the operation, certainly the business manager, and much, much more. This thing is judged finished, and that's really fascinating to me. And we see evidence of that finish in what's on the back. And Bailey asked about this earlier, so I want to include this image, and I think people get a kick out of this. You can't see this in the show, but this is what we saw when we were unpacking it and putting it on the wall. This loan from Santa Fe, New Mexico, that has not been seen in Brandywine galleries for a long time, if ever, with a really rich exhibition history, despite being that abstract extreme of Wyeth's watercolor practice. You see, it's been shown at the Whitney, the Albright Knox, now rebranded the AKG something or other museum in Buffalo, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. It was included in the Metropolitan Museum of Art exhibition, Two Worlds of Andrew Wyeth, Kerners and Olsons. It's been all over the place, and that's really significant. So right from early on, right from 1957, long before we in Wyeth world tend to think of a kind of core moment of permission to show the studies and unfinished work, which would be the early 2000s, there are works like this that are rising to the top of the heap and getting their moment in the spotlight. So just wanted to be sure to share that one with you. Many in this exhibition have never been exhibited before, and if memory serves, this is one of those. There are some great things we're really proud to be able to share for the first time, honing in on the spring house at Kuerner Farm, one of these humble working buildings that protects a spring source, doesn't let leaves accumulate in the fresh water emerging there, and also preserves the cold of the spring emerging from the earth for refrigeration purposes. Beautiful application of paint in the foreground. Again, picture the artist walking this landscape and just being stopped in his tracks by that geometry, that composition, and having to capture it swiftly. He hones in on the chicken coop that used to stand behind the house, no longer there, and beautiful wet on wet pooling colors there, kind of a blue gray tone against this evocation of the white of Kuerner Hill beyond. And there's that chimney. We zoom out to the farm work of the place and honing in on that humble apparatus of disc harrow for breaking up soil as you prepared for planting. Another portrait of that startling barn. And then we go inside the barn. This has turned out to be one of my favorite in the exhibition, Haymow. It's a remarkable space. Few people have ever seen the inside of it. People who do our plein air painting workshops often get to peek in there. It feels like a cathedral. It is a vast, lofty space. You picture the echo, picture the cool of that well-shaded space, especially on a hot day like today. It is a kind of oasis. And Andrew Wyeth made this rare depiction of that dark cavity within the barn. He captures again that outflow from the pond he called the eye of the earth. And you're learning to read this landscape by now. You'll instantly recognize the steep, short form of Kuerner Hill there as he hones in on that strange form of bubbling white water cascading over stones. And another lovely one where he gives us almost a snail's eye view of skunk cabbage. That plant I had learned in an earlier exhibition has the property of thermogenesis, able to warm the surrounding soil so that it can sprout first in the springtime. Pooling wet on wet watercolor and that core form, that guiding idea that anchors us at Kuerner Farm above. Coming to our final section that we've titled Visionary Realism, we look at some of the works that make their own constructed nature, their imaginative process, more overt. And I really love this one, where you see Anna Kuerner then at 87 years of age, almost fading back into Kuerner Hill, fading back into the landscape she'd worked for so many years. It's a really beautiful thing that I hope won't get overlooked at the very end of the exhibition, hanging right next to one of the best loved things in the exhibition. So spare a thought for cornflowers. Be sure you don't miss it. And it has that really rewarding blast of bright blue that is so startling from an artist who often works with such a reduced palette. We come to one of these really remarkable late works. I mentioned Karl Kuerner, friend, model, um, archetype of the darkness of the place, being diagnosed with leukemia, the cause that brought Helga Testor first to this place. And so intimate was Andrew Wyeth's access with this place, he even gains permission to paint Karl Kuerner in the late stages of that terrible disease. So he's capturing this friend, meditating on that imminent loss in this useful instrumental object that was key to the making of something else. And you get a sense of the utilitarian nature of these watercolors from the fact that this was laid on the floor while he was working. The dog walked over it. Dog footprints, a human footprint. Some have speculated maybe even Karl Kuerner's own foot. We will never know. Um, but an urgent improvisatory trace of an idea taking shape before our very eyes, that would culminate in this startling image of Karl Kuerner at the very end, transplanted back to the slope of Kuerner Hill, receding back into the land like the snow in springtime. A really beautiful and personal image that is in the Brandywine Permanent Collection, very meaningful to members of the family as a meditation on the end of this man's life, and again, evidence of the intimacy, the trust that he earned with this family. This is something that will be shocking to many of you. This is one of a series of works that are in this kind of visionary series reflecting on the presence of death in the Kuerner Farm landscape. You have just enough information to recognize this curve as that of Kuerner Hill. And from comparison with others in this series that has come to be known as the funeral group, we recognize that this black mass in the lower left is actually Andrew Wyeth's grave. And you might just be able to make out as I trace it with my cursor here, faint pencil lines that are the artist lying in his coffin, surrounded by some of his key models. Helga Testorf in her cape coat, and Betsy James Wyeth in her characteristic broad-brimmed hat among them. A very personal work, large format work. Look at that, 70 1/4 inches wide. That was kept for Jamie Wyeth, the artist's son and fellow artist, until after his father's death by local model and friend Helen Sapala at the house known as Painter's Folly. And these were the subject of an exhibition called Andrew Wyeth, Life and Death in 2022. And we come to the final work in my slideshow here today. Before I turn to any questions you may have, I'll turn off the screen share and be happy to chat with you directly. A familiar beloved object at Brandywine, one of the icons of the Wyeth Foundation collection that we're so fortunate now to manage through the arrangements made in Betsy Wyeth's will, a tremendous trust placed in Brandywine to share this with the world. And we're not accustomed to talking about this necessarily as a Kuerner Farm work, but after all that I've shared here today, you'll instantly recognize the Kuerner house, the bank barn, Karl Kuerner in that 1916 Stahlheimen greatcoat, Anna Kuerner in her persistent head wrap against the chronic headache she suffered for many years, and Helga Testorf in her cape coat, as well as other local landmarks, not visible in reality, but imagined in sight from the top of a visionary Kuerner Hill. These models, many of whom were not alive at the time this painting was made in 1989, dancing around an eerie maypole, one streamer, the gray-white one in the background, unattended by a person, as the artist talked about it, even as we're welcome to populate our own story and to imagine narratives into it. The artist imagined his models celebrating his own death so that they wouldn't have to pose anymore, so the story goes. He's thinking about mortality always at this place. He's thinking back to that traumatic early loss of his father in this landscape, on those train tracks so close by, at this site that contains, for Andrew Wyeth, all the inspiration a creative life would require. And I'll end there and be very happy to answer any questions. Let's see what's popped up here. I see a few in the Q&A already. Feel free to fill in others. Philip Koch, the artist, thank you for joining us, Philip. In the lovely painting Woodshed, does anyone know why those two crows were nailed up to the white wall in the first place? That's a good question there. Have I ever heard a good explanation of that? We understood that they were shot by Karl Kuerner, a nuisance to his crops. I've never heard a good explanation of that, but I'm sure there is one. So I'm going to be fact checked by colleagues in the Wyeth Study Center later, and we'll get that right. How does the Brandywine, we've rebranded, we're now the Brandywine Museum of Art rather than the Brandywine River Museum, locate and acquire Andrew Wyeth artwork that has been purchased for private collections? We should clarify that in the process of an exhibition like this one, we're not acquiring, we're loaning. And maybe you meant that. The word acquire has a really specific meaning for us, a permanent pledge to protect an object in perpetuity. We have requested, pretty please, can we share a painting in your private collection with our audiences on the walls of Brandywine for a limited term, in which light exposure will be monitored very carefully, in which vibration exposure and humidity and temperature will be monitored very closely. There's a tremendous body of research on which we draw in Wyeth World that began with the work of Betsy Wyeth herself, and really comprehensive records of the location of works in private collections for the purposes of the Andrew Wyeth Catalog Raisonné. That is the authoritative scholarly publication of the complete works of Andrew Wyeth, which is one of the things my office is working on, entrusted to the Wyeth Study Center. We keep the owner information in strict confidence, and we reach out to them directly to pass on an inquiry when other museums are interested in borrowing something that they own. We never share their information with anyone else when they've entrusted their information to us. We used our privileged relationship with key owners of Andrew Wyeth's work, whom we advise on conservation and care and indeed framing decisions. We're in such a fortunate position to be able to draw on that information in bringing these things together. But things are being sold and changing hands all the time. We are dependent on the goodwill of new owners to be willing to talk to us, and we don't always get lucky. So spring-fed is one of those current mysteries of Wyeth World. I'm sure it will resurface eventually. Let's see here. Were there other King Vidor films that Andrew and other Wyeth watch were aware of? The second part of your question I can answer from memory. The first part, I don't know the answer to that. There is a future project developing on kind of the multi-generational Wyeth family and film. The larger story of what the Wyeths took from film and what the ongoing Hollywood establishment has learned from the works of the Wyeth plural and Andrew Wyeth in particular. And there's a lot to say there. And indeed, King Vidor did pay one fascinating visit to Chad's Ford to visit with Andrew Wyeth. He was pleased to hear that Andrew Wyeth was a fan. There are great images of Vidor and Wyeth together hanging on the walls of the Andrew Wyeth studio when you take a tour together. What happened to Wolf Moon? Did I not include it in the slideshow there? Wolf Moon is one of the icons of the Wyeth Foundation collection. If it was not in the slideshow, it should have been. It's one of my favorite things in the exhibition. Very strange, short compression of space, Kuerner Hill looming over the house. You'll have to come in and see it in person. The last ribbon in Snow Hill, I like that story. I think the Andrew Wyeth narrative is a perfectly reasonable explanation of it. That he was thinking of this as a kind of a funeral observance for the loss. The mostly concealed figure, I'm going to have to look back to my image and see what you mean. The mostly concealed figure is Adam Johnson in the background, one of the members of that community around Mother Archie's church, a member of that African American community of Chad's Ford, who Wyeth famously painted the tempera Adam, which is in the Brandywine collection, was most recently on view in our previous exhibition, Andrew Wyeth, Human Nature. Glad you enjoyed, Cindy. How extensive are our archives? They are indeed extensive. We have remarkable holdings collected by, again, the brains of the operation, Betsy James Wyeth, of manuscript correspondence to and from the Wyeth family that have been a tremendous resource. That is an unprocessed collection that includes very recent history. Andrew Wyeth only died in 2009, Betsy Wyeth only in 2020. So there are privacy issues for many of their correspondence. It's held in strict confidence for the time being, but over time, that collection will be made more available for research purposes. Can tempera painting be made more robust? Woodshed, there is no great answer to, and we have the very best advice on this because we have one of the leading centers for research in the conservation of works of art just down the road, the Winterthur Museum, Garden, and Library, home to the Winterthur Conservation Program in association with the University of Delaware. There is one of my heroes, Professor Joyce Hill Stoner, one of the board members of the Wyeth Foundation, our conservation conscience in Wyeth World, who worked very closely with Andrew Wyeth on the care and feeding of his collection, and indeed even in the making of some of his artworks, advising on materials, helping him to modify things when he got a different idea. We have the best possible understanding of the technical makeup of this artist's work, far better than we have for most other artists out there, because conservation was incorporated into his method in a really unusual way. Even so, even the great Professor Stoner tells us there is no real way to respond to the problems of something like Woodshed, which are also in part between us the problem of poor conservation work that was done in an earlier generation. It was damaged by a conservation effort. So that one's tough. The good news story is what we've done behind the scenes of Snow Hill. So I appreciate you asking that question. I can share. We're able to include Snow Hill in this exhibition and to share it in North Carolina and Florida because of this very complex and costly effort we went through to use a method that was invented by colleagues at the National Gallery in Washington and place that very large painting in a monumental microclimate, which stabilizes its humidity. You stand in front of it in the gallery, it would look the same to you. It always has. You might just barely be able to tell it's now under glass, the best possible glass on the market, so glare almost entirely disappears. And very subtly on the back of the frame, an encasement has been built out that matches the frame perfectly, that protects it with this humidogel that stabilizes the humidity inside the frame. So that consideration, humidity changes as one of the destabilizing factors in tempera, is no longer a concern. That's the sort of thing we're innovating and trying in new ways. We're eager to share best practices for the conservation of Andrew Wyeth's work with public and private collection holders of his work nationwide. You're thinking of one of my favorites, George Sauter. If you'll permit a personal reflection, I shared a work, the Study for Winter 1946, that was in my first ever show. There was also a Sauter Nocturne in that same show, so I'm a big fan of that Pennsylvania Impressionist. Sauter would have been aware of Wyeth's work. The other side, I'm not so sure, but yeah, Sauter made lovely things that are beloved in the mid-Atlantic region and hardly known in my experience in the rest of the country. I'm a big fan, so kudos to anonymous attendee for being a Sauter fan. You'll have to go to the Michener Museum in Doylestown. Great colleagues up there who do good work with that story. Yeah, no shadows under the plate and saucer and Groundhog Day. It's an eerie thing. There's a feeling like the cup and saucer in particular are hovering 2 millimeters above the surface of the table. Nobody can fault Andrew Wyeth as a technician, so we have to assume this is part of that visionary construct, this eerie, quivering energy around that picture, a sense of unease and unsettled nature there. Andrew Wyeth painted in watercolors right to the end. In the exhibition Home Places, we included a watercolor made in 2008 before his death in 2009. Watercolor, perhaps less physically taxing than tempera, is the medium in which he can still express himself right to the very end. So yes, indeed, there are some really beautiful late watercolors. Comment on Scene from Above drawings like Wolf Moon. Island Funeral is his dad, so that might be a different context. But there are some really interesting kind of bird's eye view pictures. One that comes to mind is Airborne in the collection of the Shelburne Museum in Vermont. There are some, and those are helpful to us again, because I continue to, as I try to have my finger on the pulse of the wider public perception of Andrew Wyeth as this person in this strange job, just thinking about one artist all the time. It's useful to try to keep an eye on how others are talking about this artist, where we are in exhibition and publication and scholarship around this artist. If there is baggage still from that kind of 1960s and 70s moment where certain New York critics, cough, Clement Greenberg, cough, were really dug in against what Andrew Wyeth represented, that might manifest in this notion that, oh, he's merely a technician. He's got good hands. He's a mechanic of paint. That might be a very outdated notion of Andrew Wyeth's work that still pops up in some uninformed quarters. And when you see works like Wolf Moon, when you see works like Airborne, you understand that you are dealing with a visionary practice, a magical realist practice, something that is not easily fit into this box of mere technical adeptness. So yeah, thank you for raising that. When will Brinton's Mill be open to the public? Betsy Wyeth's concept of the private family home, Brinton's Mill, was not that it would be another stop on a Wyeth shuttle tour. I've heard those words expressed by those who knew her wishes on this matter. That private family home was a kind of inner sanctum, and there is not necessarily any promise that it will ever be made fully public. What we can hope for and what I can share is that public walking access to the property, which would probably mean leaving your car down at the Brandywine Museum of Art and walking up a mile and a half to Brinton's Mill, is in the cards and is coming down the pike. If all goes to plan, as soon as maybe next summer, we should be able to solve some of the bureaucratic wrinkles to piece a safe walking path together to get there. It's a fascinating place. It's much on our minds. It's one of the focal points of the 2026 exhibition we're hard at work on, with another big substantial book by design, The Worlds of Betsy James Wyeth, that treats Brinton's Mill as the first major designed environment by Betsy Wyeth, this other fascinating creative force of nature in this fascinating American creative dynasty. We want to take her story seriously and think about the choices she made in, again, pulling the wool over our eyes, presenting us this seemingly perfectly intact 18th century mill site that was anything but. It was a construct, a fascinating creation out of her imagination. Significance of Andrew Wyeth working in the most fugitive medium. I think you're referring to watercolor there as something that is famously light sensitive. I think Andrew Wyeth found watercolor a really powerful way of capturing a kind of emotional extreme of his practice, working quickly, urgently, and with full color in a way you can't with just ink on paper or pencil on paper, media he did use infrequently. Watercolor gives him this freedom and expressive possibility with quick, colorful, brushy gestures that he can't achieve even in tempera. So it is a full realization, a full actualization of a certain extreme of his practice. And he had the privilege of not thinking about how it would necessarily age over the years. Happily, another good news story, as we deal a lot with the technical side of Andrew Wyeth's work, his choice to use such a subdued color palette means that his watercolors are unusually stable. Artists who use a lot of bright reds, watch out. Some of those really bright colors can be a real nightmare for curators and conservators. Andrew Wyeth's watercolors tend to be in pretty good shape, even when in some private collections they've been left in the sunlight for 50 years. They're still looking not too shabby. We certainly don't recommend that. The really simple rule of thumb we keep in mind for watercolor in general is that they should be exposed to direct light only about 6 months in every 5 years. And we have this notion of rest in between. So we carefully moderate and moderate that light exposure. Not all light exposure is the same. These things are being seen under completely universally LED light, the best case scenario, under complete UV blocking glass, best case scenario. Even so, they do suffer from light exposure, and they are always spending a smidgen of their total life expectancy when they are there in front of us on a museum's wall. So they are special guests. It is a rare and a special thing to get to see a masterpiece of Wyeth's watercolor practice like Wolf Moon, like Evening at Kerner's on a museum's wall. So we hope you'll come down and see them for yourself. Yes, the early works are quite colorful, and there's a sense that he hones in on his mature palette a little bit later. I would identify finding that palette before his father dies, so I don't think I'd agree with your story there. Woodshed, for example, is before the loss of his dad, and he's already starting to make some really honed in, austere paintings well before that incident happens. But certainly that study for Winter 1946, End of Winter, might be even more subdued still. So there's a reflection on loss and pain, as well as light and life and joy and laughter and all these things that make up the human experience. And he does find that through that choice to limit his own colors, he can bring a really rich range of pictorial possibility. On Barnes and Wyeth, we believe Wyeth visited the Barnes at some points, and that's a reason why we can connect him with one other example of a significant place-based practice that comes to mind. Who else can we name who went so deep on a particular site for so many years? One of the few that can even hold a candle to Wyeth in this regard would be Cézanne and the subject matter of Mont Saint-Victoire in the south of France, which is well represented in the Barnes collection. So I would like to think that Wyeth would have been aware of Cézanne's work and Cézanne's pictorial commitment, even though it was not to the degree and extent of Andrew Wyeth's. We understand Dr. Albert Barnes, who founded the Barnes Foundation, was not a fan of Wyeth. So it goes. It's hard to see the mote in our own eyes sometimes, and he was a product of his time, where the art snobs were unable to see beyond, in many corners, the adulation of a broad general public. An artist who, for a period, risked being loved to death by people who were not tastemakers in the big city, people who just liked what they saw. And they were right, and the tastemakers were wrong, and the story has come full circle. And now the nerds in the academy, the curators at major museums around the country have recognized that this is a major global creative legacy. Barnes got that one wrong. I'm sure he'd say so if we could talk to him today. So it's been really rewarding to be in this new position, leading the Wyeth Study Center, liaising with the field, sharing the Wyeth Foundation collection, and to see how much possibility there is right now. There is a thought, Stephen Marvin, that Andrew Wyeth might have chosen to be buried near Kerner's, not only in pictures in the funeral group, that strange abstract watercolor I shared, but maybe in the reality if he had died in Pennsylvania. But because of his deepening commitment to, you know what, he must have died in Pennsylvania. Silly me. He died in Pennsylvania, and yet the plans developed further to be buried in Maine all the same, near another crucial subject, another crucial model, Christina Olson, and indeed Alvaro Olson in the cemetery at the Olson house, that place that has a close parallel to the Kuerner house. So I don't know why that is. As I think on your question live, it's not a matter of simply dying in one state or the other. He died in January, if memory serves. Um, and he made that choice that he had left the wishes to go back to that gravesite in Maine where Betsy Wyeth also is now buried. So when you go to visit the Olson house, you can go and pay your respects in that small Hancock Point burying ground close by. And it looks like that is the end of our questions. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope you will come and see the show in person. Look at that. We're perfectly on time. It's just about to turn 8. A pleasure to get to share this with all of you. As Bailey mentioned, we're going to have a number of other events and programs over the run of this show until September. And then if any of you are in Florida, anybody, you know anybody in North Florida, South Georgia, send them down to Jacksonville when this show will travel there in October. So thanks very much.